In 1849, a man named Amos Steck walked into the Sierra Nevada foothills with 40 pounds of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a dream that would take 3 years to kill him. He never found gold. What he found instead was hunger so deep, it changed what the word food meant forever. Number 14 on this list was considered a delicacy by men who had not eaten a real meal in 6 weeks. Number 3 was the most calorie-dense survival combination ever consumed in the American West, and modern survival experts still cannot believe it worked. And number 1 is the meal that ended more gold rush dreams than any failed claim ever did. Hit the subscribe button before we go any further, because what these men ate to survive will permanently change how you think about the Wild West. Hi, my name is Carter, and this is American Reminiscent. Number 30. Hardtack. Every miner who left Missouri, Ohio, or Georgia in 1849 packed hardtack into his bedroll like it was currency, because on the trail it basically was. Flour, water, and a pinch of salt pressed into flat squares and baked until every drop of moisture was gone. The result was something between a cracker and a brick that could survive a river crossing, a mule stampede, and 18 months in a canvas sack without spoiling. Miners called them teeth dullers, sheet iron, and things considerably less printable. The only way to eat one without losing a molar was to soak it in coffee, creek water, or bacon grease until it softened into a gritty paste. A pound of hardtack cost about 4 cents in 1849. By the time that same pound reached a California mining camp, the price had jumped to $1. Men paid it anyway because hardtack was the floor beneath every other food on this list. When everything else ran out, hardtack was still there, indestructible and miserable, keeping you alive one more day. Number 29. Flapjacks on a shovel. Not every miner arrived in California with a proper skillet. Some lost their gear crossing the Rockies. Some sold it for food money before they even reached the foothills. When a man had cornmeal, water, salt, and nothing to cook it on, he did what frontier people had done for a generation before him. He mixed the batter, greased the flat blade of his mining shovel with a scrape of pork fat, and held it over the fire until the cake browned and bubbled. 3 minutes aside, the shovel left faint grit marks in the bottom of the cake if it had not been cleaned properly, and most of the time, it had not been cleaned properly. Miners ate them anyway. A good flapjack off a shovel blade tasted exactly like a flapjack off a pan if you were hungry enough. And in a California mining camp in 1850, you were always hungry enough. Number 28. Salt pork boiled in creek water. Salt pork was the engine that ran the gold rush. Barrel after barrel of it made the journey west, packed in heavy brine so concentrated it preserved the meat for months in any temperature. The problem was the salt. Before you could eat it without your mouth blistering, the pork had to soak in fresh water for hours, sometimes overnight. Miners dropped chunks into a tin pot, covered them with creek water, and boiled the whole thing until the grease rose to the surface in pale yellow clouds. The liquid that remained was drunk as broth. The fat was scraped into a separate tin and saved for cooking everything else. The meat itself was gray, dense, and so salty it made your eyes water, but it had fat and protein and calories, and in a mining camp, those 3 things were the only nutrition that actually mattered. Number 27. Dried beans cooked in a tin can. A pound of dried beans weighed almost nothing, cost about 8 cents in 1849, and could feed a man for 2 full days. That math made beans the unofficial currency of the Sierra Nevada mining camps. Men soaked them overnight in whatever vessel they had, sometimes a proper Dutch oven, sometimes a dented tin can salvaged from a supply wagon, sometimes a leather hat that would never quite smell right again. The beans were boiled for hours over a low fire with a chunk of salt pork thrown in if the camp was lucky. The result was thick, salty, and filling in the specific way that only beans can fill a stomach that had been running on hardtack and creek water for a week. Miners ate them cold the next morning without apology. Cold beans off a tin spoon in a California River canyon at dawn is not a romantic meal, but it kept men standing. Number 26. Bacon grease coffee. Real coffee was expensive in the mining camps. A pound of green beans that cost 25 cents back east ran close to $2 in the foothills when it was available at all. So miners stretched it. They stretched it by re-roasting grounds that had already been used once. They stretched it by adding roasted grain or dried sweet potato powder when the beans ran out. And when even that was gone, some men brewed a pot of hot water and stirred in a spoonful of bacon grease because the fat gave the water a richness that plain hot water could not provide, and because the ritual of holding a hot tin cup at sunrise was worth almost as much as whatever was in it. Laugh if you want. I looked this up. Men wrote about it in diaries. Bacon grease coffee was real, it was common. And if you had been sleeping on cold ground for 4 months with nothing but hardtack and beans, it tasted just fine. Number 25. Sourdough bread from a living starter. Here is where gold rush miners earned their most famous nickname. Old-timers in the California camps were called sourdoughs, not because they were sour, though many of them were, but because every serious miner carried a sourdough starter tucked into his pack, fed daily with a pinch of flour, and kept warm against his body at night so it would not freeze and die. That bubbling, sour-smelling paste of flour and wild yeast was the most valuable thing some men owned. The difference between bread and hardtack was the difference between civilization and just barely surviving. Miners mixed the starter with flour and salt each morning, and baked rough loaves in Dutch ovens, buried in coals. Dense, tangy, chewy, with a crust that crackled when you broke it. Some starters traveled all the way from Missouri and kept baking for 20 years after the rush ended. Sourdough bakeries in San Francisco today claim their starter traces back to 1849. Whether that is history or marketing, I will let you decide. Number 24. Parched corn. Before a miner reached California, before he even reached the foothills, he had been walking for months. The overland trail from Missouri to Sacramento was roughly 2,000 miles, and for the last stretch through the Nevada desert, even salt pork went bad in the heat. What survived was parched corn, dried kernels roasted in a dry skillet until they turned golden and nutty and hard enough to crack a back tooth if you bit down wrong. Men carried parched corn in coat pockets and ate it by the fistful the same way you would eat trail mix today. Except trail mix does not taste like the inside of a canvas sack that has been sweating against a mule for 3 weeks. Parched corn had one genuine virtue beyond everything else. It required no cooking, no water, and no fire. You could eat it running, which on certain stretches of the trail was not entirely a metaphor. Number 23. Mule meat. I want to be careful here because this entry deserves honesty. Mule meat was not a choice. Nobody packed their wagon in St. Joseph, Missouri, and thought, well, if the gold does not work out, at least we have got the mule. What happened was simpler and sadder. Animals died on the trail. They died from exhaustion, from bad water, from broken legs on rocky passes, and from the simple mathematics of carrying more weight than any living creature should carry for 2,000 miles. When a mule died, the practical men ate it, and the sentimental men went hungry for another day and then ate it. The meat was dark, tough, and strongly flavored, closer to venison than beef. Miners who ate it said the trick was long, slow cooking and enough salt to mask the gaminess. It was not good. But it was protein, and in the Sierra Nevada in January 1850, protein was the only thing standing between a man and a shallow grave. Number 22. Boiled rawhide. The Donner Party wintered less than 100 miles from where thousands of miners would camp just 2 years later. The lesson was not lost. When miners ran out of food in the mountains, they did exactly what the Donner survivors had done. They cut strips of rawhide from saddle leather, wagon lashings, and boot soles, dropped them into a pot of boiling water, and simmered them for hours until the collagen broke down into a thick, nearly flavorless broth. It provided almost nothing, nutritionally. But almost nothing is not nothing. It kept the stomach from collapsing on itself, and it bought one more day of survival. Mining journals from 1852 record at least 3 separate groups that boiled leather during winter storms in the Sierra Nevada. None of them were embarrassed about it afterward. Embarrassment is a luxury. Survival is not. Number 21. Dried apples. Stewed over fire. Every supply wagon that headed west carried dried apples. Leathery brown rings strung on cord and packed in cotton sacks. They weighed almost nothing and lasted months without spoiling. Miners soaked them overnight in creek water, stewed them in a tin pot with a scrape of brown sugar, if the camp cook had any, and ate the resulting sauce over biscuits or hardtack. After 3 months of salt pork and beans, the sweetness of stewed dried apples was so overwhelming that men wrote home about it. One miner from Ohio wrote in his diary in 1851 that he sat down to a bowl of stewed apples and cried without knowing why. I believe him. There is a particular kind of emotion that comes from tasting something sweet after weeks of tasting nothing but salt. The dried apple did not taste like fruit exactly. It tasted like the memory of fruit. On the Gold Rush Trail, that was close enough. Number 20. Jackrabbit roasted on a spit. The Sierra Nevada foothills in 1849 were thick with jackrabbits. Long-legged, enormous-eared, and fast enough to make a hungry miner feel genuinely foolish. They were everywhere, and they were free. A man with a rifle, a sling, or enough patience to set a proper snare could pull a jackrabbit out of the scrub brush on almost any afternoon. Gutted, skinned, and skewered on a green stick over coals. A large jackrabbit could feed 2 men. The problem was the fat. Jackrabbit has almost none, which meant the protein burned through a working body without leaving anything behind. Miners who ate nothing but jackrabbit for weeks developed a hollow, wasting hunger that food seemed unable to fill. The old-timers called it rabbit starvation. The fix was to roast the animal in bacon grease or salt pork drippings. Fat made the rabbit into a meal. Without fat, it was just something to chew. Number 19. Wild onions and ramps. Spring in the California foothills brought wild onions and ramps pushing up through the creek soil, pungent green shoots that smelled like a dare and tasted like garlic crossed with something older and wilder. Miners pulled them up by the handful and ate them raw, boiled them into broth, and stirred them into beans. The smell that followed a camp that had been eating ramps was something that no amount of creek water could fully address. Men who had been living in close quarters for months did not care. What they cared about was that wild onions were packed with vitamin C, the one nutrient that the standard mining camp diet of salt pork, hardtack, and beans provided in quantities hovering somewhere around 0. Without vitamin C, scurvy came. And scurvy, as you will hear more about later, was not a quiet way to go. Number 18. Rice and saltfish. The Chinese miner's daily staple was so simple it barely qualifies as a recipe. Steamed rice cooked in a covered pot over a low fire, with strips of salt-dried fish laid across the top to cook in the steam. The fish flavored the rice absorbed the fish oil. The result was a complete protein, a balanced calorie source, and a meal that cost a fraction of what American miners were spending on their inferior supplies. Saltfish kept for months at any temperature. Rice weighed almost nothing relative to its yield. Miners who traded with Chinese camps and who were willing to set pride aside for an afternoon reported that a bowl of rice and saltfish was the best meal they had eaten since leaving home. Most of them never admitted this publicly. 1850 California was not a place that rewarded that kind of honesty. Number 17. Acorn mush borrowed from native women. The Miwok, Maidu, and Yokuts people had been eating acorn mush for thousands of years before a single 49er set foot in California. Acorns were gathered in autumn, dried, shelled, and ground between stones into a fine flour. The flour was leached in cold water for days to remove the bitter tannins, then cooked into a thick gray mush that was dense, nutty, and filling in a way that nothing else in the foothill landscape could match. Some miners learned this preparation from native women near their camps and survived difficult winters because of it. Most miners did not learn it, and the ones who did not are the ones who ended up boiling their boot leather. The knowledge was offered freely. The men who ignored it did so because of who was offering it. That stubbornness killed some of them. The record is clear on this. Number 16. Canned oysters straight from the tin. Here is the entry that surprises everyone. In the middle of the California wilderness, in camps accessible only by mule trail, you could sometimes buy a tin of canned oysters. Eastern oysters, packed in brine and sealed in soldered tins, made the sea voyage around Cape Horn and arrived in San Francisco in quantities that supply merchants, then hauled into the mining districts at extraordinary markup. A tin that cost 15 cents in Baltimore sold for $1.50 in the camps. Miners bought them anyway because a tin of oysters tasted like civilization, and civilization was the one thing the gold rush systematically destroyed in every man who came looking for it. You peeled back the lid, fished out an oyster with 2 fingers, ate it cold from the brine, and for 30 seconds you were somewhere else entirely. Then you went back to panning gravel in a freezing river. Number 15. Bear meat roasted over coals. When a miner got lucky enough to bring down a black bear, the whole camp celebrated. Bear meat was the feast meal of the gold rush, the one food that made men put down their pans and actually sit together like human beings for an evening. The meat was rich, dark, and fatty in a way that jackrabbit and salt pork could never match, with a flavor somewhere between beef and wild game that responded beautifully to slow roasting over a hardwood fire. More importantly, bear fat was rendered into grease that served as cooking oil, butter substitute, and leather conditioner for weeks afterward. A good-sized black bear provided enough fat to transform every meal in camp for a month. Men who hunted bears were respected in the camps, with a specific kind of reverence usually reserved for men who had actually found gold. Sometimes the bear was worth more. Number 14. Rattlesnake fried in bacon grease. And here is the one that survives in diaries, in letters home, and in the memoirs of old miners writing 50 years later with the specific pleasure of someone describing a meal they genuinely enjoyed. Northern California in 1849 was thick with Pacific rattlesnakes, heavy-bodied and slow enough in cool morning temperatures that a careful man with a long stick could pin and behead one without losing a finger. The snake was gutted, skinned, cut into sections, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in whatever pork grease was in the skillet. The meat was white, firm, and mild, tasting faintly like chicken with a hint of something wilder underneath. Miners who ate it once asked for it again. One miner from Kentucky wrote home to his wife in 1851 that rattlesnake fried in bacon grease was the finest thing he had tasted in 2 years of California living. His wife, the letter suggests, did not share his enthusiasm. Number 13. Pemmican traded from native camps. Long before the gold rush, mountain men and fur trappers had understood something that the 49ers had to relearn the hard way. The best survival food on the North American continent was not something invented by white settlers. Dried venison or elk was pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, then pressed into dense bars that kept for years without refrigeration and provided roughly 3,000 calories per pound. Miners who camped near Miwok or Maidu settlements sometimes traded for pemmican with tools, cloth, or coin. Those who acquired it ate it cold off the saddle, sliced it into boiling water for a quick broth, or simply chewed a piece the size of a biscuit, and rode for 10 hours without stopping to eat again. Modern survival experts have studied pemmican for decades. Their conclusion is straightforward. Nothing produced before the 20th century fed a working body more efficiently. The people who invented it were already gone from most of their land by the time the miners arrived to learn from them. Number 12. Mulligan stew. At the end of every week in a mining camp, the cook took stock of what was left. Leftover beans, a heel of salt pork, some dried onion, 3 hardtack biscuits that nobody had wanted, maybe a piece of jackrabbit that had been sitting in a covered tin since Tuesday. All of it went into the pot together with creek water and whatever wild herbs grew close enough to grab without walking too far. The whole mess was simmered over a low fire until it became something thicker and darker than its individual ingredients had any right to produce. Miners called it Mulligan stew, or slumgullion, or simply the pot, depending on which part of the country they had come from. It tasted different every single time, and it was never the same stew twice. And it was almost always better than anything that had gone into it individually. That is either a culinary miracle or a comment on how hungry everyone was. Probably both. Number 11. Soda biscuits baked in a Dutch oven. If hardtack was the floor of Gold Rush cooking, the soda biscuit baked in a cast iron Dutch oven was the ceiling. Flour, baking soda, salt, lard, and just enough water to bring the dough together, shaped quickly into rough rounds and dropped into a preheated Dutch oven buried in coals with more coals heaped on the lid. 12 minutes. 14 minutes if the fire was running cool. When the lid came off, the biscuits were gold on top, soft in the center, and steaming in the cold mountain air with a smell that could stop a man mid-sentence. A good camp cook who could produce reliable biscuits twice a day was spoken of in terms that 21st century people reserve for entirely different categories of human achievement. Men rode 2 miles out of their way to eat at a camp known for good biscuits. That is not an exaggeration. That is in the historical record. Number 10. Boiled wheat berries. When flour ran out and a miner still had a sack of whole wheat grain, he did the only thing he could do. He boiled the kernels whole. Wheat berries dropped into a pot of salted water and simmered for an hour, and they turned into something chewy and dense and faintly sweet. It had none of the comfort of bread, but it had all of the caloric, stubborn value of grain that refused to be nothing. Miners ate them plain, mixed them into bean pots for bulk, or fried them in pork grease until they crisped on the outside and turned nutty. It was not a meal anyone chose. It was a meal that happened when everything between wheat grain and actual food had been exhausted. There is a specific kind of eating that happens when you have stopped tasting your food and started simply fueling yourself. Boiled wheat berries lived permanently in that category. Number 9. Condensed milk from a can. In 1856, a man named Gale Borden received a patent for condensed milk. a process of reducing whole milk under vacuum until it became a thick, sweet, shelf-stable paste that could be sealed in a tin and shipped anywhere. By the early 1860s, condensed milk was appearing in California mining supply stores, and miners were buying it with an enthusiasm that surprised even the merchants selling it. A spoonful stirred into coffee transformed the experience entirely. Drizzled over biscuits or hardtack, it was the closest thing to dessert most miners had tasted in months. Children in mining families drank it straight from the tin with a guilty efficiency that their parents pretended not to notice. Condensed milk was not cheap and it was not nutritionally complete, but it was sweet and thick, and it came in a can that could be opened with a knife in 30 seconds, and in a mining camp, those were qualifications enough. Number 8. Vinegar pie. A mining camp in the Sierra Nevada foothills was approximately 1,000 miles from the nearest apple tree that was producing anything worth eating. Fruit was a memory, and pie was a memory inside that memory. So when a camp cook wanted to do something that felt like an occasion, he made vinegar pie. Apple cider vinegar, water, sugar, flour, and eggs mixed into a custard that the acid made taste faintly, optimistically, like lemon or apple, depending on how generous you were feeling. Baked in a lard crust in the Dutch oven until it set into a trembling pale yellow filling that was absolutely not fruit pie, and absolutely was the best thing in the camp that week. Men ate it without irony. The cook who could produce a vinegar pie was capable, in a mining camp, of briefly making men forget where they were. That was no small thing in California in 1850. Number 7. Salted crackers and lard. Nobody talked about this one. It was the 4 o'clock in the afternoon meal, the thing you ate standing over your gearbox when the beans from lunch had worn off and supper was still 2 hours away. A plain cracker, the cheaper and plainer the better, smeared with a thick layer of lard straight from the tin. The fat was dense and slightly porky, and it sat in the stomach with a heaviness that was not pleasant exactly, but was deeply, fundamentally filling. Miners ate crackers and lard the way people today eat whatever is at the back of the snack cabinet at the end of a bad day. Not because it was good, because it was there. And because hunger does not negotiate. I have eaten worse things than a plain cracker with good fat on it. Most people have. They just do not usually admit it in public. Number 6. Jerked venison. Deer were plentiful in the California foothills in the 1840s, before 300,000 men arrived and shot most of them. In the early years of the rush, a miner with a rifle and an afternoon to spare could bring down a deer and spend the following day turning it into jerky that would feed him for 2 weeks. Strips of venison cut thin against the grain, rubbed with salt and black pepper, hung over a slow smoky fire of green oak for 6 to 8 hours until they turned dark and leathery and reduced to roughly a third of their original weight. The result fit in a coat pocket, weighed almost nothing, and could be chewed for 20 minutes per strip with something like satisfaction. Frank James, decades later, credited venison jerky with keeping the gang alive after Northfield. Gold Rush miners would have understood that completely. Jerked venison was the food that bought you time, and time was always what you were running out of. Number 5. Pine needle tea. The cure was growing directly above their heads, and most miners walked past it every day without understanding what it was. Young green pine needles, the fresh growth from the tips of branches, steeped in boiling water for 20 minutes, produced a bitter, resinous tea that tasted like drinking a forest and contained enough vitamin C to reverse early-stage scurvy within days. Native peoples across the North American continent had known this for generations. Some miners learned it from indigenous neighbors. Some camp doctors prescribed it when the connection between the tea and the disappearing symptoms became impossible to ignore. The miners who drank pine needle tea through the winter months kept their teeth and their strength. The miners who refused it because it tasted like medicine, and they were not sick, just tired, found out the difference between tired and sick in the most direct possible way. The pine trees were free. The knowledge of what they contained was priceless. Number 4. Flapjacks drowned in sorghum. Sunday was different in the mining camps, not because of religion, though some men held services, and not because the work stopped, though sometimes it did. Sunday was different because Sunday was when the cook made flapjacks with sorghum molasses, the same cornmeal batter from every other morning of the week, but cooked on a proper griddle or on a clean shovel blade wielded with ceremony, and drowned at the table in dark sorghum syrup poured from a clay jug that had been carried from Missouri or bought at ruinous price from a supply merchant. Sorghum made everything it touched taste like the American South, sweet and dark and faintly smoky, with a depth that maple syrup never quite reached. Men ate 4, 5, 6 flapjacks without speaking. The Sunday flapjack meal was the one weekly reminder that they were still human beings who deserved a good breakfast. On the Gold Rush Trail, that reminder was worth a great deal. Number 3. Pemmican mixed with wild honey. When a miner was lucky enough to have both pemmican traded from a native camp and wild honey raided from a bee tree in the foothills, the combination produced something survival experts studying gold rush diets in the 20th century have described in terms that border on admiration. Pemmican, already the most calorie-dense portable food ever produced on this continent, mixed with raw wild honeycomb to deliver fat, protein, carbohydrate, natural antimicrobials, and enough calories to fuel 2 days of hard labor in a single handful. The fat in the pemmican absorbed the honey, and the sweetness transformed the dried meat into something that tasted, miners reported, almost like a confection. Almost. The wax in the honeycomb was chewed like gum and spat out. The rest went down fast. Men who had this combination ate it slowly because they knew exactly how rare it was and wanted it to last. That is the specific pleasure of eating something extraordinary in an extraordinary circumstance and knowing in the moment that it will not come again soon. Number 2. Chili beans with mule fat. Nobody planned this dish. It happened the way most great American food happens, out of necessity and the specific creative pressure of having almost nothing and needing to feed people anyway. Pinto beans simmered for hours with dried chili peppers traded from Mexican miners, seasoned with salt and wild herbs, and finished with rendered mule fat when no pork was available. The fat gave the beans a gamey depth that was different from pork, but not worse, just different. The way everything tastes different when you cook with what you have instead of what you want. Mexican miners in the California camps had been making this for generations before any 49er arrived, eating it with tortillas that American miners did not know how to make and could not be bothered to learn. What eventually became American chili was born right back here, in these camps, from this combination of desperation and borrowed knowledge that nobody gave proper credit for. You are welcome. Number 1. The 49ers' last meal before abandoning the claim. This is the meal that ended more gold rush dreams than any bear attack, river flood, or claim jumper ever did. Salt pork, hardtack soaked in creek water until it stopped resisting. Coffee boiled from grounds used 3 times already. The same meal he had eaten every morning since arriving, except on this morning it tasted different because he had finally done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not work. The gold was not there. Or not enough. Or the season was ending, and another winter would finish him. He ate the last of what he had, looked at the river one final time, and left. 300,000 men came to California between 1848 and 1855. Most of them ate this exact meal on a morning exactly like this one, then walked home with less than they arrived with. The gold rush was never really about the men who found gold. It was about the ones who did not. There you have it. 30 meals that fueled, nearly killed, and occasionally almost satisfied the men who turned California inside out, looking for something most of them never found. Drop a comment telling me which one you would actually eat. Subscribe to American Reminiscent. None of this history tastes the way they taught you in school.